Emotions can and should play a large, long-term role in financial and retirement planning. But those same emotions, if left unchecked, can create real havoc when it comes to your portfolio. Last week, my colleague Tim talked about how the same part of the brain that gets triggered when you're in mortal danger also gets triggered when you lose money. And this week has certainly given us a lot of emotions around what's happening in the markets and the global economy. Today, we are going to go into what we're continuing to see coming out of Russia and Ukraine and how that plays into how we are viewing portfolios. We're also going to talk about that as part of the written commentary today. Now, before we dive into that, I want to start by talking about planning. Emotions and how you feel should absolutely play a large part in determining how we think and feel about our long-term financial plan. And as many of you who've worked with us for a long time know, we always start with planning. Planning is what gives us the insight into how we should be allocating your portfolio. And the emotionality around the decisions in life and those things we can and can't control within our financial picture should always be looked at through the lens of how you feel. But we have to keep in mind that those same feelings and emotions that we have that are so important around our financial plan can play a completely different role when it comes to how we look at portfolio allocation and what we're going to be doing to make sure that we keep a level head during times like we're experiencing now. Let's start with what Russia is trying to achieve with this war. First and foremost, they are attempting to take away what they deem as Western influence in the Ukraine and create a buffer between NATO countries and Moscow. Russia does not want NATO to expand east and place new strike weapons close to the current Russian border. And ultimately, what they would like to do is take Europe back to those pre-1997 configurations and create that buffer between the West and their current border. Next, let's talk about what the globe's response, outside of a handful of countries, has been. We know that NATO is not going to get involved from a military standpoint in terms of sending troops in as part of this conflict. What NATO is doing is sending money, sending equipment, and the world as a whole is sanctioning Russia from the state level, the banking sector, and in every area that they possibly can to put pressure on Russia to change the tactics that they're utilizing so far. And what we've seen here in the last few days is Russia is really being forced to rethink what they thought would be a very quick assault on Ukraine and a very easy taking of the capital. That has not been the case. Ukrainians have fought diligently and fought very hard to keep their sovereignty, and you're seeing Russia begin to attempt new tactics in order to see if they can push further toward the capital. Now, overall, from an investment implication standpoint, what we are really looking at is how is this going to affect the global economy? Now, the good news is, from purely a GDP perspective, Russia only makes up about 3% of the global GDP. Ukraine only makes up 0.3% of the global GDP. So from an overall perspective, the implications of this financially for the global economy should not be overly burdensome. The areas where it is affecting us more deeply is in the oil and gas sector. Europe gets about 40% of their oil and gas from Russia and has to walk a very fine line between how they are supporting Ukraine and not disrupting that flow of oil and gas that so much of their economy depends on. Us in the United States are fairly insulated from how this will affect our economy in the short term. So when we're really looking at this from a risk standpoint, we refer to it more as headline risk. Market volatility is coming into play, not because something that is affecting fundamentals, but more from a sense of how investors are feeling about what's going on and what is to come. So to circle this back to how emotions come into play and how the good decisions that can be made on the financial plan based off of how we feel can be the exact opposite of the decisions we make when it comes to how we allocate a portfolio. I want to talk a little further about a chart that came out over the last week from Bloomberg and Goldman Sachs that break down historically how markets act and react both during a global crisis like we're seeing right now and then the aftermath in the short term. Now, as we look at this chart, what I'm not saying is that the current conflict with Russia and Ukraine is the same as some of these other events. But what I am saying is if you look at how markets perform in both the S&P 500, the US stock market, in Europe, and in the emerging markets, as we can see, whether it's the Gulf War, whether it was the last time Russia attempted to move into Ukrainian space through the annexation of Crimea, or even more recently during the Taliban takeover of Kabul, you can see that during the process of that event, markets do tend to act in more volatile ways. But it doesn't mean that we necessarily see large downturns in the markets even 3 months out. From a US standpoint, in every one of these last 8 events, if you move out 3 months in the market, you can see that we've had tremendous positive performance. Now, from a portfolio standpoint, for any of you who are clients, we are heavily overweighted US in virtually every portfolio set that we have here at 10 Capital. And we do believe that overweighting Europe or the emerging markets at this time is not necessarily best suited for portfolio construction. We do believe, however, that as we move forward through this conflict, once we get past the initial shock of what Russia attempted to do and is doing currently, we will more than likely see markets rebound in a way that we have experienced during some of these past conflicts. In summary, what is happening right now in the Ukraine is horrible. It's an absolute tragedy. And I know myself and everyone here at 10 Capital is keeping the Ukrainian people forefront of our thoughts and our prayers. From a portfolio perspective, as Tim discussed last week, we do not invest based off of emotion, and we have a fundamental process that drives those decisions. That allows us to look for opportune times to enter into what has been a volatile marketplace right now, and keep in perspective that long-term headline risk like we're experiencing right now fades, and that can lead to strong long-term performance. We've had calls with many of you this week to talk through your thoughts and your feelings. That's what we're here for. But in the grand scheme of things, we're going to leave the emotions and the feelings front and center in the financial plan and let the fundamentals drive how we look and act through these type of situations. Thank you for your time. We'll talk to you soon.